Okay, let's make a prompt start. So we'll just have about 45 minutes, no more, looking at the challenge of writing, trying to burrow down what are the moves we can be focusing on, and then thinking about that disciplinary emphasis, that subject-specific emphasis, supporting all of our pupils to make that translation. So, we can recall that this challenge is one of the hardest acts in school, whether that's year 3 or year 13. Writing, the act of writing, is probably the hardest thing we expect our people to do. The problem is, it just feels so natural. It feels so normal and accessible. We can all do it. So we're going to recall and think about that challenge. And I want us to think about having a child in mind when it comes to writing as well. In the book, I've written about quite a few experiences, individual pupils, kind of masks their real names, etc. But the reality of pupils sitting down, taking GCSEs who I've taught, who I knew were going to struggle because they couldn't compose accurate sentences. They couldn't express themselves as they wanted in writing, even though they had great ideas. And the more and more I did projects with young children, one of my best experiences was a year 5 writing project with York primary schools, and just looking at modeling. But so many experiences in the classroom of year 5 pupils struggling to just make those basic moves that we assume they can undertake. So I want to start with just a couple of multiple choice questions. So for those people who are remote, you can pop an answer in the chat. If you're in the room in Bolton, you can have a discussion on your table. So this first question, pretty large scale. How many people in England are considered to be functionally illiterate? So what that means is they've got some basic reading skills, but they'd struggle to read instructions on a medicine bottle. They'd struggle to write an email to their boss, and they broadly avoid reading and writing because they struggle with it so much. They're functionally illiterate. Is it A, 7.1 million? Is it B, 5.1 million? C, 3.1 million? Or is it D, 1.1 million? Give you a little bit of time to reflect upon that. So our dominant answer is A, but we've gone as far as A, B, C, or D. So a bit of variety. Let's see what the answer is. The answer is A, 7.1 million. And, we know the reality is that around a quarter of children struggle upon entering school with basic language skills. A quarter of pupils don't get expected standard leaving primary school. And there's no shock when a quarter of students don't get the basic standard in English language and other GCSE subjects. And they're often children who are in a family of multi-generational functional illiteracy, where parents can't quite help. So this is a big picture of the challenge of reading and writing being part of the issues that are long-term. And then we get this proportion of year 6 pupils, the expected standard in writing. So as we know, it's teacher assessment. Quick reflection on this one. Is it A, 1 in 5 pupils? Is it B, 1 in 8 pupils? Is it C, 1 in 12? Or is it D, 1 in 15 pupils who do not meet the expected standard in writing, which is a teacher assessment for those secondary school colleagues who aren't so familiar? So we're getting A's, B's. A's are coming in. The answer is indeed A, 1 in 5 pupils. And if we consider teacher assessment, although we've got standardization routines, etc., is broadly more forgiving than a standardized test, and yet still 1 in 5 pupils don't meet the expected standard. What that means in real terms is in September, year 7 pupils who've often had a number of weeks away from school also, lots of those pupils are going to struggle to write simple sentences and to write about the complex topics they're expected when they get to secondary school. And that Matthew effect again rears its ugly head, where pupils who can write well and confidently, broad and rich vocabulary, are able to quickly seize upon those different topics in history and science and computer science and German or French, and their peers are still struggling. And they develop a sense of themselves as a school student who is academic or they're not. I see it, I've seen it in my teaching. I see it with my own children, where you end up having this self-concept that you're good at maths or you're just good at school. And so much of this is about your ability to do these basic fundamental access points to the school curriculum. And just take a moment. So if you've got a pen and paper, let's, a little bit like doing an active translation, let's do some writing that makes us feel like a novice again. So let's try and just imitate a mirror sentence. Let's just imitate writing a mirror sentence. And if you were to want to make it really feel like a novice pupil, you'd use your other hand as well. But I'm fine for you to use your hand. So just think about that and try and read it too, of course. Can you write that sentence? How fluently can you do it? What speed? What's the legibility of your handwriting when you're doing that? Give you a moment to give that a go. Okay, now, a little bit like doing the active translation, reading about Boris and parties, whenever we're asked to do mirror writing or write with our other hand, it makes us feel a little uncomfortable. It breaks those ingrained habits we've established over decades. But for our pupils, they're often facing this quite literal struggle, this motor skill struggle for lots of pupils. And far too many secondary school pupils still don't have legible, consistent handwriting, and they don't have that handwriting fluency. So these strategies, these approaches are often good to use with staff because they help remind them of the experience of being a novice pupil, whether that's year 2 and 3 developing early handwriting, or whether that's in year 10 and 11. And lots of our pupils, we know, end up masking these issues. They start to write smaller and smaller, kind of hiding any spelling issues or handwriting issues. And the sentence, when you unpack it, is about unveiling and kind of challenging this notion that writing is natural. It isn't. It's one of the most unnatural things we do. Our brain is brilliant at being able to kind of hijack kind of aspects of its ability to be able to do this act from a really young age. But it's not easy, it's not natural, and it's incredibly complex. And if pupils don't master spelling, handwriting, those basic transcription skills, then it means that choosing words in their writing becomes harder. Thinking about their audience, they've got no space left in their mental bandwidth to do that. So let's just quickly compile why writing is hard. What are some of the things, some of the moves in the writing game? Just take a moment to reflect on that, just the degree of moves each time you write, even just a single summary sentence, whether it's writing for yourself, just writing a sentence to remind yourself of what the teacher's said, or whether it's a 5-paragraph essay. We've got all these challenging moves. And so for our pupils, we've got to scaffold it, break it down, and know where they might have weaknesses and be careful to build it up. So the model I'll share in this session, the Simple View of Writing, is about building up, taking these moves, clustering them together so that struggling writers benefit, certainly, but everyone benefits because it just makes more accessible the complex game of writing. And if we just look at some of the more recent evidence, so No More Marking, they've got big national sample sizes, and they've showed that there are gaps in terms of prior attainment, and there are gaps in terms of what's come before. So in September 2020, that emboldened key finding that year 7s were significantly behind where they'd expect them to be at this stage. And then in 2021, they'd made better progress, which is good news. You can make rapid progress with writing, things like handwriting, fluency practice, things like sentence level, sentence building, etc. But because they'd fallen so far behind, they'd still had issues. And so their score is still behind what you typically see. And actually, if you look at that key finding emboldened, that in year 7, their score of 550 is the same as it was when they're in March of year 6. So they're falling off over the summer, post-SATs, and it's about trying to recover that. And the different types of writing can set pupils back in year 7. And often in secondary school, teachers of geography, teachers of science aren't so aware of the supports and scaffolds needed to develop writers, particularly those quarter of pupils struggling to meet the expected standard. So there's a problem here that we're solving. And it's a problem often for many more pupils than we think, but lots of teachers don't quite fully understand that issue. So we need to define the problem before we pick some strategies. And I think one of the things that, again, we can easily miss in our curriculum is how the subject changes over time. So if you just take a moment to look at these two pieces of writing, they're both from history. So on the left-hand side, you can see it's a diary entry for the Great Fire of London. And often in Key Stage 1, but also in Key Stage 2, children best understand history through stories, through characters, and they're often asked to write recount texts and narrative type texts because they're comfortable doing so. And they get really good in primary school at writing narrative style texts and creating this engagement. But then on the right-hand side, you see just a typical history essay in secondary school, and pupils struggle with this type of argumentation text. And they're moving, these are both history writing, but they're so different as to feel like completely different subjects. So even from year 2 into year 6, there are obvious changes, but from year 6 to year 7, there can be a quantum leap in expectations and writing tasks. So there's a couple of things here, isn't there, in terms of our awareness. One, there's a point of transition, understanding what our pupils know, and often they're leaving year 6 with brilliant grammar knowledge, with really good, strong accuracy with writing, and yet then they go into year 7, and in a lot of subject areas, that writing is not sustained and the scaffolds aren't in place, and they move to different writing tasks, and they struggle with them. So this is part of the writing problem we need to solve. Have we got coherence between Key Stage 1 and 2, between 3 and 4, and across those phases? For struggling pupils, you'll often identify they've either got a reading or a writing issue or a bit of both. And obviously they're two sides of the same coin. And we often describe them differently. So in primary school, this greater depth description here describes lots of moves, but it's all a bit vague, isn't it? So then you move forward to GCSE and you've got completely different set of expectations. So in primary school, we're expecting write effectively for purpose and audience, distinguish the style, getting the right register, making sure it's appropriately formal. Where we're using speech, we're doing it appropriately. There's these more general pointers, accuracy, colons, hyphens, the obsession with semicolons. And then in secondary school, you've got this history question, which is focusing on concepts. It's focusing on using lots of knowledge. It's focusing on argumentation. So again, it's almost like the game keeps on changing for our pupils, and we need to make sure our curriculum identifies the changing game and is really clear about the moves in history, the moves in English, the moves in science, making notes, the moves in art, doing annotation, or in design, writing up a product evaluation. And I think too often we create, and the evidence bears it out, this is not just my opinion, we create scaffolds, scaffolds for paragraphs, scaffolds for essays, scaffolds for evaluation in design technology or textiles. but we don't actually take those scaffolds away. So by the time they get to GCSE, they can't independently write these tasks with the fluency and skill we expect. And then we get this history, planning, developing an argument about changing causation, sustaining judgment, and then lots and lots of SPAG accuracy. Well, I'd ask the question, what does sustaining judgment look like in history? Does it mean writing 3 paragraphs? Or does it mean more subtle moves? And too often, again, in history, we've got limited curriculum time. We'll scaffold, we'll do some modeling, but pupils won't get a strong sense of what sustained extended writing looks like, about what good planning moves look like. So we have to overlearn and over-practice those. There might be some good approaches to planning across the curriculum, but then they fit in history and English, but don't fit in modern foreign languages or in geography. So we need to be careful again about those subject differences and find out where they are.